Hi there. I'm recording this and hopefully won't have to start over or cut much out because I'm getting over an illness. I've been feeling better, but I was running a bit of a fever the past few days. Took a COVID test. I don't have it, luckily. I think I'm getting better, but I haven't put anything on the channel in a while, and I was planning to do a personal thoughts today anyway, so I figured I'm going to try it regardless of whether I'm feeling under the weather or not. So, I want to talk a bit about the concept of nostalgia here, especially as it applies to things I'm interested in, like old anime games, old websites, that kind of stuff. Because I often get comments about my site in particular, and sometimes the videos I put on YouTube, from people saying that they like how nostalgic or retro they feel. And of course, these are usually compliments, and I'm always honored by every compliment I receive. But I'm not sure that nostalgia is the main motivator for me. I do feel that as we age, we start to feel like the time we were a child, especially like a teen, was somehow the best time to be alive in all of human history. And all the TV shows and games and movies from that period were just somehow better than everything coming out today. And I've always understood that everyone has been saying that for as long as humans have been around. Even in, like, if you look at old writings in the Roman Empire, they're talking about how much better everything used to be before this modern degenerate period. So I've always been a little skeptical about that at first, feeling like, okay, how much of this is rose-tinted glasses? How much of this is just a psychological kind of hallucination I'm having that everyone else has? That said, I do, I talk to a lot of Zoomers and younger people, and I do notice what seems like a real difference today is that I feel like a lot of the young people who are like teens or early adults seem to be agreeing with me that the time I was a kid was better, because a lot of them are really interested in old anime and old internet culture. And I feel like they are to a degree that is unusual, and maybe that's just a consequence of a few technological things. I think there's one, it's just easier to access older stuff than it's ever been with streaming services and YouTube and all that. Two, society is really fractured in terms of where we get our entertainment sources, so there aren't a lot of broad cultural kind of uniting art pieces or media pieces. And so I feel like people have more of an ability to specialize. Not to say there aren't kind of defining or influential games or whatever that come out, but it's I think there's just more of a ability to silo. So maybe that helps that in a way. But in any way, what I wanted to talk about is that I think in all of it, there's a peril to indulging in nostalgia about that kind of thing. Not that I mean, clearly, and that doesn't mean rejecting the past. Quite the opposite, in fact. Especially because I think there's something kind of sinister to what I call the nostalgia bait industrial complex. So, to begin with, I want to start a bit about the origins of the idea of nostalgia. And it's interesting when you read about this. I'll put an article about it in the description. But when the idea of nostalgia was first conceptualized and written about, it was actually considered a serious mental illness. There's an article from 1688 that said it was sympathetic of an afflicted imagination and caused by, quote, continuous vibration of animal spirits, unquote. And that might sound harsh, because lots of us love indulging in nostalgic reflections on simpler times when we were kids and so on. And I think that is a natural phenomenon that exists to some degree in everyone and always has. But I do think there's a lesson to the kind of diagnosis of it as an illness which is worth remembering. So as I said, the younger we are, the more magical things tend to appear and the stronger of an impression they create. And this is an obvious phenomenon. I think I had I used to have a hard time understanding what exactly Schopenhauer was talking about in the particular passage I remembered from his essay on aesthetics, but I think this is what he's talking about. I'll quote it here. The reason the impressions we receive in youth are so significant, the reason why in the dawn of life everything appears to us in so ideal and transfigured a light, is that when we then first become acquainted with the genus, which is still new to us through the individual, so that every individual thing stands as a representative of its genus, we grasp therein the Platonic idea of this genus, which is essentially what constitutes beauty, unquote. Okay, so that's kind of a heady idea, but it seems like he's almost saying, like, I don't know, like a tree you see as a kid, every individual tree comes to you as the Platonic form of a perfect tree, or something like that. Which I kind of get what he means about that. There's a simpler quote, which I think says it very beautifully, by poet Louise Gluck, who says, "We look at the world once in childhood, and the rest is memory." I like that a lot. So that's an obvious phenomenon. For all but the luckiest of us, who live truly magical and enriched lives, and the truest NPCs who have absolutely nothing in their heads in the first place, most of our lives are spent trying to recreate the world we inhabited as children. But I think there's a danger in this as well. The extreme version of the, what do you want to call it, the nostalgist, is in a state of complete inertia and regression, unable to contribute to any kind of community at all. And you see this with the kind of soy males who collect old, obsessed with old video games and stuff. And I say that as someone who, plays a ton of old video games. But there's a certain type who spends all the time bemoaning the present to the point that reliving the past almost seems more like self-harm to him. And the relationship becomes completely passive, like a child sucking on its mother's teat, rather than creative and free, which is what we should seek out of our engagement with art, old or new. Living in a way that recreates any sense of childlike wonder requires a lot of energy and passion, but the apex kind of nostalgia fag would shamble around like an opium addict. And that nostalgist is also usually just another form of mindless consumer. In substance, there's nothing really different between the idea of, wow, look at these 90s polygons, give me it to me so I can grasp what it was like to be a child again, and the eternal NPC who says, ew, look at these old-looking graphics, remake it for my slop-consuming brain. In both cases, there's no real appreciation of artistry, of history, of culture, etc. That nostalgia fag is as much of a victim of the pop culture industry as anyone. And that's really what's going on right now. I think that's why there's no kind of mass cultural stuff, is because mass cultural stuff, what does that mean? Uniting artworks. It's just, I feel like it's a long progression of capital where, starting in the 2000s or so, there's a big, everything in Hollywood's becoming sequels and remakes and sequels and remakes. People have been complaining about this for over 2 decades now. Yeah, pretty much, almost. Probably coming up on it. But it's just sequels and remakes. Why? Because they've maximized that it's a lot easier to just constantly remake and reuse ideas than create new ones. And now they're at the apex version of that. And by they, I mean what's kind of taking the place of Hollywood, like Netflix and media industries and all that. You don't even have to remake it anymore because they recognize this nostalgia motivation. It's just about repackaging the old stuff instead of, they don't even have to make remakes anymore. They just have to make it profitable for huge corporations to rape old franchises by making hordes and hordes of plastic crap. And I'll give an example of this. So, 1983 film, A Christmas Story. Everyone who's an American has probably seen it. They play it 24 hours a day on Christmas Day. I saw it as a kid. Most people probably have. It's nothing special, but I loved it as a kid, obviously. But when I was a kid, I didn't see thousands of t-shirts and toys related to it at every store around Christmas time. But now I do, because they've realized that there's a market to be made by appealing to nostalgia fags, so they're taking no prisoners with that. And there's no real difference between making some garbage remake for the same reason. The nostalgist just turns everything into slop. And being that nostalgia-obsessed person is particularly dangerous because in a way it sustains a quite artificial idea. that older works of art are somehow obsolete or can only be relevant for those who were their target audience at the time of creation. And sure, older works of media reflect the time in which they were made. But the idea that the only route to appreciating and understanding works of art is somehow found in such a specific historical experience seems to me quite restrictive and primitive. This is the story we're told by society, but it's a completely artificial one that only exists to sustain the churning out of plastic garbage. And I used to think it was an exaggeration to say that trends are artificial and created by companies to sell bullshit, but now I really do think this is kind of true. This is anecdotal evidence, and it's not enough to prove my point. But when I lived in Japan, I was at a language school, and some of my closest friends were students from China and Russia, and I liked these guys, and these are just a few guys. They don't represent everyone, but I don't know. It just seemed like they were the only ones who didn't have that piece of dogma in their heads that if a piece of media, and in this case, let's say maybe anime or movie or something, is more than 5 years old, it's somehow irrelevant or uninteresting. They didn't have this bias towards always consuming what was current and in vogue. They just seemed very unfazed by consumerist pressures. And maybe it's extreme just because it's, I don't know, Japan has such an anime industry that it's kind of a weird... digression, but it's weird when you're in Japan because it feels like this is the land of anime and that culture, but people who aren't from Japan know more about old anime series and stuff than a lot of people in Japan. One, because torrenting is so frowned upon there, and two, just because, I don't know, they have to work more to research that stuff. It's just not like passively fed into them, so I feel like they get more of you get a broad historical sweep when you have to work a little to understand that culture, kind of from an outsider perspective. Broad strokes. I'm sure there's people who do that in Japan, but I just think about that. So I can't give full sociological reasons for this, but I've heard this said about Russians and other Eastern Europeans that just kind of, when you're poor and the Pirate Bay is your Netflix, of course you're much more likely to stumble on some weird old movie or game. I remember the Russian guy there. This was like 2017, and he was showing me videos of Tourette's guy from YouTube. You remember that? And he's like, fucking shit! And he's like, oh man, imagine you're going to another country and homestaying with this guy. And I'm like, you're awesome, dude. But yeah, maybe there's something similar in China where you're kind of outside of the Western consumerist trend machine. And I'm not going to glorify that, because a lot of the case that has to do with repressive government censorship. But I do like that there's people there who reject kind of artificial trends like that. Because plenty of people will play and love old games and movies if they try them, and it's only market forces that wage campaigns to convince people that they're somehow obsolete and constantly have to be remade. Like, I mean, fuck, man. I remember when in high school we'd go to like websites that had Super Mario Brothers from 1985 on some ROM and play that at school, and kids fucking loved it still. But I think, of course, they would. If you told Dante Alighieri that Virgil's poetry was outdated and needed to be adapted or remade for the 14th century, he'd laugh at you. No one thought this way before the modern consumerist slop media economy. It was the opposite. What was greatest was what was most ancient and eternal. So, but I want to balance that by saying that we also always have to innovate and reflect. But the point is just that no one innovates out of nowhere. We always look back to older models. Even the most original artists did so, and especially them. Like the Impressionists were inspired by Dutch masters like Frans Hals, and Picasso looked back to eccentrics like El Greco. And we ignore this because we're sold a message that the older something is, the more obsolete it is, and that's absurd. Those on the cutting edge of the avant-garde are always those who are looking far back enough to come into contact with the source, and thus truly be most free and open. And when we look back on those old works that are special to us, and recognize that they now reflect a world that no longer exists, we're tempted to become fatalistic. And we are tempted to play into the trap and dwell on the fact that they reflect a world that no longer exists. And in doing so, I think we keep them dead. And because we refuse to give them life. Of course, they can never have the same cultural power that they had in the exact same way again. But as models to use, as examples of what could be, they still teem with life and vigor. And if you look back at things you're nostalgic for, like for me, it's the internet before like 2013, or old images of Comiket, like that kind of early 2000s Japanese otaku era, or whatever else you're nostalgic for. But look at it and ask, whatever it wasn't created by people who did nothing but sit around and moped about how the time they lived in was terrible. It was created by people who tried to make things better by creating. And being a historian and documenting is an important part of creating, so you can name what was great about the past in a way to direct yourself with greater awareness. And that's an important point, to be discerning. In my case, for example, I love a lot of things about old internet pages. I love seeing people make web pages that are like minimal and stripped down and compact. But even though it is very authentically old-fashioned, I really don't like modern web pages that try to recreate that gaudy animated GIF overload look from the 90s and early 2000s. So it's not an arbitrary date attached to that style that makes it good or bad, but it's the essence of my values about web design in general. Even though I do think there's some appeal about doing those big overloads of gaudy animated GIFs and stuff in the old GeoCities style on modern web pages, because nowadays we have much faster internet speeds, so they can load much faster, so they're not as annoying as they used to be. What's crazy is a lot of those websites load like much faster than any modern news site today, which would be funny if it wasn't so sad. But ranting about web load is something for another time. But what I appreciate above all about things like old Comiket culture, old internet, is just that there's authenticity to it. And I often look at images of old Comiket attendees or old Japanese otaku culture like that, and it just strikes me, compared to, like, I don't know, when you go to a con or something today, that those guys are dressed pretty normally. They don't spend half their time on their appearance making every single person aware that they like anime, because they're already at a con for it. They didn't do this kind of stuff to look cool, because none of it was cool. Their focus was always on creating and not consuming, and especially not on presenting themselves. It wasn't about being a rebel or making a fashion statement. It's about contributing to something greater and doing so in the most authentic way possible, freed from artificial restraints of society. It was for weirdos and enthusiasts who chose to be outcasts because of their passion, and that's what it's really about. And that kind of environment is the essence of all real heightened cultural activity, and it can't be forced. It can only evolve naturally. And that's why we have to look back on examples of it, but also not just try to recreate it plainly, I guess. So, anyway, I guess that's the point. Just don't be a nostalgia fag because you look silly and it's keeping you stifled. But do continue to watch old good things and not new bad things. And stop playing into the narrative that past media is constrained by its time period and thus somehow only relevant because of nostalgia. Creatively appropriate the works of the past and be explicit about what is good about them, I guess. I don't know. Maybe a couple messy ideas there, but anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.